When we see a failing restoration, we have three options. We can replace that restoration, we can repair the restoration, or we can refurbish the restoration. This video will address the ramifications of replacing the entire restoration. In the U.S., 60 to 70% of adult restorations are replacements of existing restorations, often placed by another dentist. So here's how it works. If you placed the restoration, you'll watch it. But if someone else placed the restoration, you'll pull it out and replace it. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Studies have shown that 50% of resin composites are replaced after 7 years, and on average, 60% of amalgam restorations are replaced after 10 years. There is a wide variation on the decision to remove and replace a restoration and the reasons for doing it. Several studies have interviewed dentists and shown that most dentists cannot explain their criteria for replacing a restoration. There are 4 papers referenced at the bottom of the screen that show that sound tooth structure is removed and the cavity is enlarged when a restoration is placed. Why is that? Well, the answer is that we are using a handpiece. Here is the preparation after removing the restoration. Now, let me put the restoration back in place. That black line represents the tooth structure you removed in the process of getting the restoration out of the tooth. I don't care how good you are with a handpiece, you always remove some tooth structure when you remove a restoration. Here we have photos before and after removing an amalgam. On the right, you can see a white stain and a dark stain. These are actually remnants of the lesions that were left behind. They are almost definitely arrested now, but most dentists would remove that tooth structure. That will make the preparation even bigger. And if you're planning to replace this amalgam with composite, you would have to remove all of this stain on the enamel margin. So again, you will be making your preparation larger. And this can be even worse when you're removing composite than it would be for removing amalgam, because it's often difficult even for an experienced dentist to distinguish between tooth structure and tooth-colored restorative material. You can see here in my illustration that it would be very hard, especially when you get into dentin, to determine where composite ends and tooth structure begins. So the chances are very, very high that you're going to remove some sound tooth structure. This composite has a questionable area. It's stained, it looks like it might be cavitated, it may be carious. But I'm not really sure how far gingivally this restoration extends. On the right, you can see something suspicious on the root margin. The restoration is a little easier to see than the one on the left, but once you get into dentin, it will be difficult to tell and very easy to remove sound tooth structure. I want to go back to this bullet point. Sound tooth structure is removed and the cavity is enlarged, or the cavo-surface margin is expanded when a restoration is replaced. In this study, the researchers asked dentists how they would treat existing restorations. And when those dentists recommended replacing the restoration, in 70% of the cases, that would have involved increasing the number of restored surfaces. Let me show you what that means. Here we have an occlusal amalgam that is close to the mesial marginal ridge. So you go in and find that the enamel is undermined or unsupported, and even though it's been fine for years, you decide you have to take out the marginal ridge. And now our occlusal has become an MO. We have gone from one surface to 2 surfaces. But what if the original restoration was a DO? Now, when you remove the restoration and decide to involve the mesial, this DO becomes an MOD, which you know from earlier this semester is not a nice thing to do to a tooth. We have gone from 2 surfaces to 3 surfaces. This is not just an amalgam problem. Here we have an occlusal resin. Both the buccal and the lingual walls seem to be undermined. So this might turn into a buccal, occlusal, lingual. So our 1 surface restoration is now 3 surfaces. After we remove this large occlusal amalgam, we see an undermined lingual wall, so we would want to include that in our preparation, and our occlusal is now an OL. None of this is good for the strength of the tooth or the longevity of the tooth. This is a pretty large DO restoration. You can imagine that when we remove it, we will find that the distal lingual cusp and the mesial marginal ridge are weak. So our DO becomes an MODL. This is now a complex amalgam. A complex restoration is one that covers multiple surfaces, often including 1 or more cusps. As if it were not enough that we're weakening the tooth by removing the restoration, there's also evidence that replacing a restoration can negatively affect a tooth's longevity. Here's how that works. Going back to the previous example, we replace this DO amalgam with an MODL amalgam, and now this cusp is weak, and at some point that cusp fractures and breaks off. Now we place a crown on the tooth, and at some point the patient develops symptoms. And we have to do endo, and we choose to do it through the crown. And we restore our access with a material that is different from the crown material. And eventually the tooth breaks off at the gingiva, and we're left with unrestorable root tips. And so the tooth is lost. This has been called the death spiral by more than one author. So continually replacing a restoration until the tooth is no longer in the patient's mouth is not a good thing to do to a tooth, and it's not a nice thing to do to the patient who's connected to the tooth. Some studies show that replacement restorations don't even perform better than any of the other treatment approaches that are more conservative. And the next video will begin to address those other options.